What if the stars above us haven't always followed the same paths they do today? What if the calendar we use to observe God's feasts have drifted, subtly but significantly over the centuries? In today's video, we're going to take a deep dive into some of the mysteries found within the book of 1 Enoch. One that speaks of an ordered system of time, where the sun, moon, and stars move through the gates in the sky under the leadership of God's appointed angels. Enoch describes a 360-day year, carefully divided with 4 additional days to mark the seasons. But then something changes. The stars begin to stray. The order starts to unravel. And that raises some big questions. Why do we now observe a 365-day year? Why are the stars no longer in the same position they once held during key seasons like the spring equinox? And could these cosmic changes be connected to warnings Enoch gave about rebellion, sin, and even the flood? This isn't just about astronomy, it's about understanding time, the way God may have originally intended, and possibly reclaiming what's been lost. Timekeeping, calendars, and the stars have always been a part of God's design. The more we dig, the more we see how everything was ordered for a reason, and how much has been lost or distorted over time. In today's video, we're diving deep into the book of 1 Enoch again, specifically into the role that the stars play in tracking time, and what may have happened when their rhythm was disrupted. We'll also discuss precession, the significance of Aries and the equinox, ancient 360-day calendars, and how all of this may tie into something I call gate counting. Enoch 82, 9-13. This is the law of the stars, which set in their places, at their times, at their set times, and in their months. These are the names of those who lead them, who keep watch, so they enter at their times. Their 4 leaders who divide the 4 parts of the year enter first, and after them come the 12 leaders of the orders who divide the months, and the 360 heads of thousands who separate the days, and the 4 additional ones with them are the leaders who separate the 4 parts of the year. As for those heads of thousands between leader and leader, one is added behind the position, and their leaders make a division. These are the names of the leaders who separate the 4 fixed parts of the year: Milkiel, Helimelech, Melael, and Narel. These verses outline a heavenly system of order and leadership, where specific angels oversee time, from days to months to seasons. Everything is structured, nothing is random. The same applies to the movements of the sun and the moon. But what went wrong? Here's the thing. We now know that the solar year is exactly 365.25 days, not 364. And when we look to the stars, they're no longer in the same position they once were. Something shifted. That brings us to Enoch chapter 80, which may shed some light on this mystery. Enoch 86-7. Many heads of the stars will stray from the command and will change their ways and actions, and will not appear at the times prescribed for them. The entire law of the stars will be closed to sinners, and the thoughts of those on the earth will err regarding them. I don't believe this warning is poetic or a metaphor for something else. It sounds like a literal cosmic disruption, a sort of change predicted in the stars. If so, the stars, which were once precise and predictable, would begin to drift from their appointed times. The predictable rhythms of the stars would shift, and people would lose their understanding of time, at least in regard to the stars. Stellar and tropical precession. What Enoch describes seems to line up with what science calls stellar precession, the slow shift of the constellation's position in the sky over long periods of time. And this is something we can observe. Thousands of years ago, the sun rose in the constellation Aries during the spring equinox. Today, it rises in Pisces. Clearly, something has changed. But here's where we need to be careful. Many assume that this shift is caused by the Earth wobbling on its axis, a concept known as axial precession, which leads to what's called tropical precession. According to this model, even the equinox itself slowly shifts over time, but this idea doesn't fully hold up under scrutiny. Around the world, we find ancient structures, like the Padmanabha Swami Temple in India, the temples at Abu Simbel, the Mayan pyramids, and Stonehenge, that are still aligned perfectly to the equinoxes and the solstices, just as they were thousands of years ago. If Earth's axis were truly wobbling and shifting the position of the equinox, we would expect these alignments to be off by now, but they're not. So what does this mean? It suggests that while the stars have moved, the sun's position at the equinox has not. In other words, the equinox hasn't shifted, which directly challenges the idea of axial precession and tropical drift. So, precession is real, but it may not be caused by the Earth's wobble. The movement of the stars could be something else entirely, and that something else might be exactly what Enoch warned us about, a judgment or a consequence of sin, outlined in Enoch 80. This is just a theory, but sin reached its peak just before the flood, and according to Scripture, it will rise to the same level again before the end. Enoch's warning about the stars no longer appearing at their appointed times was given before the flood and could point to a cosmic consequence of sin that occurred during the time of the flood. Maybe this disruption in the heavens was part of the same judgment that took place on earth in Noah's day. In fact, Genesis 6:12 through 13 says, "And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. The end of all flesh has come before me." Enoch's warning was from before the time of the flood, and Enoch 80 suggests that heavenly bodies would no longer follow their proper paths. A dramatic shift. Could it be that this judgment extended beyond just Earth and affected the order of the stars? Something else that's really fascinating is the connection between angels and the stars. Throughout Scripture, stars are often symbolic of angels. For example, Revelation 12:4 says, "The dragon's tail swept a third of the stars from the sky." And in Job 38:7, during the creation of the world, it says, "The morning stars sang together, and all of the sons of God shouted for joy." There appears to be two sets of rebellions that took place among the stars, one at the beginning of creation and the other after Enoch's words in Enoch 80, where it says, "Many heads of the stars will stray from their command and will change their ways and actions, and will not appear at the times prescribed for them." Enoch 18:10. "And beyond these mountains is a place, the edge of the great earth. There the heavens come to an end. And I saw a great chasm among pillars of heavenly fire. And I saw in it pillars of fire descending, and they were immeasurable towards the depths and towards the height. And Uriel said to me, There stand the angels who mingle with women, and their spirits, having assumed many forms, bring destruction on men and lead them astray to sacrifice to demons as gods, until the day of the great judgment, in which they will be judged with finality, and the wives of the transgressing angels will become sirens. Beyond the chasm I saw a place where there was neither firmament of heaven above, nor firmly founded earth beneath it. Neither was there water on it, nor bird, but this place was desolate and fearful. There I saw 7 stars like great burning mountains. When I inquired about them, the angel said, This place is the end of heaven and earth. This has become a prison for the stars and the host of heaven, the stars that are rolling over in fire. These are they that transgressed the command of the Lord in the beginning of their rising, for they did not come out in their appointed times. And he was angry with them and bound them until the time of the consummation of their sins, 10,000 years. This passage seems to describe a rebellion of 7 angelic stars that are distinct from the later group of stars mentioned in Enoch 80, where the stars begin to stray from their path. These 7 stars are held in a sort of cosmic prison outside of our view, whereas the stars that begin to migrate from their path and cause men to err are still visible. This fusion of an angelic rebellion and cosmic disorder strengthens the idea that sin didn't just disrupt earthly life, it altered the heavenly order, just as Enoch describes. The stars, once steady and trustworthy markers of time, may have become a reflection of the chaos introduced through the rebellion. Before the flood, the constellation that was most likely on the equinox at the beginning of the year was Taurus, or the bull. There are some archaeological evidences for this. The constellations migrating may have been a result of sin, but some claim that this precession, or the movements of the stars through the equinoxes over thousands of years, appear to tell a story. Enoch warns that mankind would go astray in observing the stars, and by elevating them to a place of worship. This may be one reason why many believers today are hesitant to give any significance to the stars, even when it comes to calculating time or constructing a biblical calendar. But Enoch makes a clear distinction between rightful observance and idolatry. He writes, "They will turn back from all their ways, will err, and will take them to be gods. Evil will multiply against them, and punishment will come upon them to destroy all." This is one example of men who erred in worshiping the stars. Where ancient Egypt worshipped the constellation Aries, it's important to understand that the stars and constellations themselves are not pagan. They were created by God for signs, seasons, days, and years. What became pagan was how different cultures began to worship them, or assign them meanings that departed from God's original design. But the constellations, as part of the heavens, were created by the Most High, and may have held a very different and righteous purpose in ancient times. Also consider the fact that the number 12 appears repeatedly in Scripture. 12 tribes, 12 apostles, 12 gates of New Jerusalem. It's possible that the 12 constellations, which appear in nearly every ancient civilization, were once rightly named to align with the 12 tribes of Israel, or used in a system that mirrors God's order. In the book of Enoch, we see how the stars are described as being under order, with leaders assigned to their courses and divisions. This suggests the constellations and star groupings were part of God's timekeeping system, and not just a backdrop for storytelling, but markers to help count days, months, and years. This would mean that the constellations weren't originally for astrology, but used for the calendar and covenantal purposes, part of the design for making time and observing appointed feasts. Over time, as humanity drifted into idolatry and corrupted knowledge, the true meanings were lost or distorted, as Enoch warns in Enoch 80, where men begin to worship the stars in error. But we can reclaim understanding of the heavens as God intended, as a witness to his order and timing. In any case, understanding Enoch's calendar requires paying close attention to the sun, moon, and stars. So let's revisit precession. There's one source I found that suggests precession, the slow shifting of the stars, might not have started as early in history as many people think. But to be honest, it's a bit of a stretch. What's more commonly accepted is this. Most ancient cultures, 2,000 to 4,000 years ago, began their year when the sun entered the constellation Aries, overlapping the equinox. This time of year lines up with the spring equinox, the movement where the sun crosses the celestial equator, signaling the start of spring. Now here's where it gets a little tricky. Today, during the spring equinox and due to precession, the sun no longer sits in Aries. It actually rises in the constellation Pisces. But we still call this point 0 degrees Aries, and something called tropical astrology. That's just a system that keeps Aries locked to the spring equinox date, around March 20th through the 21st, even though the stars have shifted. So, in ancient times, Aries really was the constellation behind the sun at the start of spring. Today, we use the name Aries for tradition's sake, even though Pisces is what's physically there in the sky at this time of year. Here's a few of the other nations or cultures that use the sun on the equinox with Aries to start their year. Now let's circle back to the constellation Aries and examine the historical records of nations that place the start of the year just after the spring equinox. Philo of Alexandria wrote somewhere before 50 CE that the spring equinox began when the sun entered the constellation of the Ram, or Aries. Additionally, Philo claims Moses started the year in the vernal equinox. A Roman philosopher, Macrobius, from the 5th century CE, wrote that the Roman year was first established in March, where most of the ancients started their year. In Ptolemy's time, around the 2nd century CE, the sun appears to enter Aries and the spring equinox at the same time, around March 21st. Because the equinox was seen as the natural starting point of the year. In Antiquity of the Jews, Josephus states that the Passover on the 14th day of the first month, the sun is in the constellation Aries. For many, if not most, ancient civilizations, this transition into spring, whether exactly on the equinox or shortly after, was seen as the starting point of the year, often because it was tied to agricultural renewal and planting cycles. When I measure the sun's position through the gates mentioned in 1 Enoch, I consistently land just after the spring equinox, due east, as the true starting point of the year. This approach, which I call gate counting, maps time by tracking the sun's movements through the gates. I believe the equinox serves as a rough starting point for many ancient cultures, but specifically just after the equinox is where Enoch's calendar begins, in what I've found. I'll explain how gate counting works in more detail in a future video, but here's the core idea. Much of what appears original in ancient civilizations may actually be a distortion or a counterfeit of what God has already established. I believe this applies to Aries and the equinox. My method for counting the days through Enoch's gates only aligns when the year begins after the equinox, not before. The calculations don't work otherwise. And finally, some early Jewish sources, those closer to when Enoch's calendar was still in use, also support this, noting that the sun's position at the equinox and its alignment with Aries marks the beginning of the year for the Israelites. On the Gregorian calendar, this date was March 20th or the 21st. 360-day calendars. There's a theory worth considering, that the solar year may have originally been a 364-day year, perfectly aligned with the calendars described in the Book of Enoch. However, due to sin or celestial disobedience, as mentioned in Enoch 80, where the stars began to stray from their appointed paths, time may have fallen out of alignment, adding an extra 1.25 days. Now, this idea might sound far-fetched at first, but there are two likely biblical stories that could help explain this shift in time. First, in Joshua 10, we're told that the sun stood still in the sky during a battle, extending the day so Israel could win. This could potentially account for the addition of a full extra day. Then in 2 Kings 20, during the reign of King Hezekiah, the sun moved backwards 10 steps on the sundial that might symbolize or even result in a fractional shift, possibly contributing to that additional 1/4 day we now account for in the 365.25-day solar year. This also ties into the structure of the Zadok calendar, which begins each year on a Wednesday and separates weekly Sabbaths from high Sabbaths. If the year was originally 364 days long, then every date, including the Sabbaths and feasts, would consistently land on the same weekday every year. But if time stretched out by just over a day, as some suggest, that built-in weekly cycle would slowly unravel over centuries. And this is also why we're now commanded to count for Pentecost, because the days of the week shifted. Of course, this is only a theory, but it's one definitely worth exploring. It may also be that the 1.25-day difference was simply never counted as part of the year, intentionally left unreckoned, as Enoch 75 describes 4 intercalary days that divide the seasons but are not included in the official year's calculation. And then there's Enoch himself, who was taken up at the age of 365. Was this just a coincidence, or could it be a prophetic sign, a hint at the calendar's future drift, or a subtle nod to the extra day that must be accounted for? In a future video, I plan to dig a little deeper into this possibility and pulling together with it the idea of the head of days, a potential additional day at the very beginning of the year that may help explain what to do with that extra 1.25 days and fits in perfectly with counting the gates. So, other 360-day calendars. In Enoch chapter 75, we're told that 360 angelic overseers or leaders are appointed to govern the 360 regular days of the year. Then 4 additional leaders are assigned to 4 extra days that divide the year into 4 seasons. Enoch 75, 1-3. The leaders of the heads of thousands who are over all of creation and over all the stars have to do with those 4 days that are added. They are not separated from their position according to the calculation of the year, and they serve on the 4 days that are not reckoned in the calculation of the year. These 4 intercalated days are part of the calendar, yet they're not included within the 360-day count. At first, this might seem like a small detail, but it's actually quite important. I bring this up because many scholars have suggested that the calendar used by modern-day Judaism, based on a lunar cycle, was likely not the original system used by ancient Israel, but instead archaeological discoveries and clues embedded in scripture point to Israel using a solar calendar or lunar solar built around a 360-day year. As one example, a scholar cited in a Cambridge University article put forth the timeline of the Genesis flood account, which stretches from the 17th day of the second month to the 17th day of the second month of the following year. And doing the math, it reflects exactly a 360-day year made up of 12 months of 30 days each. Even more compelling is the prophetic timeline in Revelation 11 and Daniel 12, which describes 1,260 days. When you divide 1,260 by 30-day months, it comes out to 42 months exactly, which perfectly matches a 360-day calendar. However, the modern Jewish lunar calendar, with months fluctuating between 29 and 30 days, cannot cleanly account for this time frame. 360 days would not be an issue for the Enoch calendar because I believe it can be referred to as a 360 or 364-day calendar because the 4 days are intercalary days. Also, many ancient cultures followed a 360-day calendar, but I believe that this was also a counterfeit of God's original design. In the book of Enoch, there's a distinct warning about the 4 intercalary days. Days that were to be acknowledged but not counted within the regular 360-day framework. I believe Enoch's warning wasn't just for us today as we attempt to reconstruct God's calendar, but also for the nations that live closer to Enoch's time. These nations may have ignored or misunderstood the role of these intercalations, which led them to error in their timekeeping. Enoch 82, 4-5. With the 4 additional ones that divide between the 4 parts of the year that lead them and enter with the 4 days. People err regarding them and do not calculate them in the numbering of the entire year. Because they err regarding them, people do not understand them precisely. Many ancient cultures used a 360-day year, often divided into 12 months of 30 days each. This pattern appears across the world, from ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, Persia, India, to the Americas, and the Mayas, Aztecs, and even the Incas. Although many of these civilizations later had to add extra days, either to account for the shift in the solar year or to adjust for the natural drift in the seasons due to missing 4 or 5 days. This worldwide pattern points to either a shared origin or an ancient recognition of a simpler, ideal year. What's interesting, though, is that both the flood timeline in Genesis and the writings of Enoch point to a 360-day year. Could it be that these cultures were reflecting an original system given by God, and that later deviations like the extra day and precession came as a result of sin or astronomical changes described in Scripture? It is interesting that these nations closer to Enoch's time had a 360-day year, and Enoch warned that those nations would err regarding the additional 4 days, either by omitting them altogether from the count or intercalating them incorrectly, which led them to error. Enoch 82:5. People err regarding them and do not calculate them in the number of the year, because they err regarding them and people do not understand them precisely. For they belong in the reckoning of the year, and indeed record forever, one in the first gate, one in the third, one in the fourth, and one in the sixth. So what do we take away from this? The book of Enoch gives us a picture of a highly ordered creation, one where the sun, moon, and stars were not just for signs, but active participants in telling of time and seasons. When we look at ancient records and how many cultures align their calendars with the sun's position in Aries, and before that Taurus, it all points back to the time when the heavens moved in harmony with God's original design. But then something obviously changed. Whether through God's natural means, rebellion, sin, or cosmic judgment, the stars began to shift. And as Enoch warned, people began to err, not just in timekeeping, but in understanding. The loss of the original rhythm may have led to confusion among the nations and even among God's people. But we don't have to stay in that confusion. The scriptures, ancient writings, and even the stars offer clues. This isn't about astronomy or historical accuracy. It's about restoration. It's about finding God's true timing so that we can align ourselves with the Creator's appointed times. To walk in sync with His calendar is to walk more closely in covenant with Him. And while we may not have every answer yet, the search continues. And each step brings us closer to His intended design. And if this video encouraged you or sparked some new thoughts, I hope you'll share them. Leave a comment and consider subscribing. Thanks for watching. In the next video, we'll dive deeper into the structure of the year and how gate counting fits into this bigger picture. That's all I have for now, so shalom, and I'll see you next time.